Hey, what's up everybody? My name is Isaiah. I'm a licensed professional counselor and you are watching Therapy Today. Today I am reacting to an interview with Abigail Shrier, whose book I happened to pick up in the library just as I was reacting to a video by Diane, who was on the Estranged Parents channel, and she happened to mention this book that was somehow really revelatory for her. And so I was interested because she was very set against therapy and how therapy was not helpful. And so I wanted to see what Ms. Shrier's take was on therapy and how that's affecting kids today. Now, Ms. Shrier has gotten some flack for her previous book, which has been labeled anti-trans. And so a lot of people have written off her opinions because they labeled her a transphobe. And so I am trying to just take this book on its own merits, some of the talking points that she brings on their own merits. While some of you may not agree with how I approach that, I do think that as a journalist, she does have a responsibility to hold institutions, organizations accountable, and that's historically been the role of a journalist through their investigative reporting. And so I do appreciate maybe some of the flaws and the concerns that she points out about therapy and its relationship with kids and parents, and I'm willing to address those and be open to some of the trends that she's finding. One thing I will say is that her research is about general social trends. That means that her research is not going to explain exactly what's going on with your specific situation, but it's talking about generally and averages and what things are moving towards in society. That's what she's pointing out, not that everything that she says is going to be directly applicable to each and every person. And so I decided to turn to this Ben Shapiro interview. I'm sure that if you're not on the Abigail Shrier bandwagon, you're also not too enthused about Ben Shapiro in general. That's okay. We are just using this as a launching point to talk about some of the ideas that they discuss. And if you want a fuller context, I would encourage you to read the book for yourself or to check out this video in its entirety. It is an hour-long video. I'm not going through all of it. So I'm going to do a little bit at the beginning where she talks about the problems, and I'm gonna do a little bit at the end, which I have not watched fully, where she talks about potential solutions. So with all of that set up, please do like and subscribe. That helps the channel to grow and helps us to create more content for you all. We are expanding to doing some more work outside of this home studio right here, so I'm really excited for that and for you all to see that. Make sure you have notifications on and that you're subscribed so that you can watch those videos as soon as they come out. With all that, let's dive right into it.
Abigail, thanks so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Oh, it's great to be here. Great to talk to you, Ben.
So let's talk about what's ailing the kids. Why don't we start from the sort of Jonathan Haidt proposition that there started to be this massive uptick around 2010, 2011, 2012 with regard to suicidal ideation rates. He traces that to the ubiquity of social media, to cell phones, to the ability of teenagers particularly to have all of this instant feedback in perverse echo chambers. You really say in your book that it's much more about the sort of therapies that we've been using for kids who are troubled. The kids have always been troubled. It's just there's been a systemic change in therapy. What do you make of Haidt's theory, and how does it contrast with your own?
I'll say off the bat that the rise of social media, especially like he talks about, for adolescents who are used to instant gratification and are being trained by social media to have instant responses, new material right away, that is absolutely a concern and something that I have no problem with him or Shrier talking about, as absolutely this is definitely a problem for teenagers. And we recently in Virginia had our governor issue an executive order, I think, banning cell phones in schools. I don't know whether it's elementary, middle, and high school, but I know there's a lot of pushback about it. And I just don't know at this point, now that the cat's out of the bag when it comes to phones and social media, how you even enforce something like that. But yes, absolutely, that impulsivity, that quick response, and that training for an instant gratification, I can see that being connected with some of the impulsivity that we see sometimes when it comes to suicidal ideation and acting on those suicidal thoughts.
Right. So, there's a lot of agreement between me and Haidt. Honestly, there's way more agreement than disagreement. I think, and my last book was about a social contagion spread largely by influencers on social media, right? I'm very aware of the danger of how bad social media has been for young people, including their mental health. And I agree, and I wholeheartedly support his effort to get them out of schools. I think that's a no-brainer. It's something we've known is bad for kids, and having them on their phones in school is just really doesn't make any sense. And there are a lot of harms that come from it. Okay. But does it totally explain the mental health decline of young people? No, it clearly doesn't. Let me just give you one statistic, although I can give you a few, but let me give you one. In 2016, according to the CDC, 2016, 1 in 6 American kids between the ages of 2 and 8 had a mental health or behavioral diagnosis.
That's absolutely a lot of kids, especially at a very young age. I think she's going to end up tying this to the over-therapization or the proliferation of therapy and therapists in a lot of different avenues of life. What I would say as a caveat to that is that according to the DSM, and by a lot of just general ethical practice, you're not supposed to be diagnosing kids under 6 years old. Maybe some exceptions to that might be some neurodevelopmental disorders that you might be able to identify early on. There might be some speech pathologies or some developmental differences that you can identify earlier on, and that would get subsumed under the label of a mental health disorder, even though you wouldn't say like, these kids are being diagnosed with depression or anxiety at age 2.
Those kids, these are little kids, they weren't on social media. They're not on social media now, but they definitely weren't back in 2016. But also, if you look across countries, look at countries like Israel, okay, Japan, the youth are all on their phones in these countries. In fact, in Israel, they give smartphones to kids younger than they do in America. But their mental health in terms of anxiety and depression is better. And the reason is because it isn't just a question of the phones. It's also a question of the unhealthy life we've given kids, which includes this constant therapy, this constant sense from schools, from parents, and yes, from therapists, that there's something wrong with them, that they have trauma, and that they need a diagnosis and medication.
And I'll say from reading the book, this is kind of the baseline thesis that Shrier is working from, that the therapeutic model of parenting and therapy being involved in schools, in parenting, and in mental health in general, she's arguing that therapy has overreached and taught kids and parents that their kids are fragile and need to be protected. And that's what she's saying is doing a disservice to these kids and making them unable to cope with or unable to grow out of needing therapy in the long term.
So let's talk about that with regard to specifically young kids, then we'll sort of move up the age chain here.
Sure.
So when we talk about kids that you're talking about, the kids who are 2 to 8, and the sort of mass therapy that has now been, foisted upon these kids, the overdiagnosis of these kids, it seems like two separate phenomena for boys and for girls. For boys, there's always been a sort of over-medicalization of boyhood. This goes back to the 1990s, this idea that if a boy can't sit still, which if you've ever met a young boy, they literally cannot sit still, they're just motoring around all the time, that somehow represents a break from normality and must be medicalized. And that for young girls,
I'll say this for the boys, I'm smiling a little bit because my son, I don't even know if the mic is picking it up, but even now as he's doing his rest time and I'm recording this video, he's thumping upstairs, running around the bedroom. It's not restful at all, but that's his time to kind of be himself and play. And so I do resonate with that. I think also as we talk about boys and ADHD, we have the stereotype of what ADHD looks like, and that does a disservice to girls because we think of that hyperactivity, we think of the loud exuberance and the interrupting and the inappropriate behaviors, but some of the subtler signs of ADHD fly under the radar when it comes to girls in schools, and sometimes that can get missed also. So that kind of cuts both ways when it comes to some of these gender stereotypes and labeling normal behaviors as problematic.
Girls, insecurity, which again is kind of normal among young girls, that is also a medical issue. What do you see in terms of the over-medicalization? Which are the things that have been treated as medical problems when in reality they're just failures, for example, of parenting or structure?
So shyness, we never hear a kid described as shy. They have social phobia or social anxiety, right? Every child who's inattentive is told they have ADHD. And by the way, they're often told by the teachers. No one's checking to see if the teacher is particularly good or if the lesson is particularly interesting to a 5-year-old boy. No, the child has ADHD and they refer him to for treatment. And this goes on from phobias, all these things, testing anxiety. If a child is defiant, he has oppositional defiant disorder. It couldn't possibly be a problem of character or discipline. So everything has become sort of therapized. We've all been bathed in therapy, and normal behaviors, unfortunately, are not only diagnosed, but what we do is we make all these things worse by accommodating them.
Okay, so I want to pause a little bit. She's getting on a roll here, so I want to pause and talk about some of this stuff. I think she's absolutely making a fair point when it comes to maybe overdiagnosing, and I'll talk about some of the tensions that brings up later. But yes, sometimes parents and teachers are the first ones that are gonna notice that maybe something feels out of the ordinary or outside of the normal range, if we wanna call it that, which might be indicative of something mental health going on. But in terms of responsible practice, you should not be identifying and labeling any diagnosis based on one particular presentation. So if a kid is hyperactive during a particular class or has difficulty listening one day, it should be an extreme and overall trend of behavior and responses and emotions, as opposed to just cherry picking one piece of evidence and then saying, oh, they have this full-blown diagnosis. All that to say too, I can also agree with her point that we should not be negatively labeling different emotions such as anxiety or sadness or shyness, things like that. I talk about this language with a lot of my clients that our emotions are our emotions. They don't have to be good, they don't have to be bad. They might not feel particularly helpful in a particular situation, but that doesn't mean that they're bad. What it seems like she's arguing is that the proliferation of therapy has had us sort our emotions into categories. Oh, these are good, these are fine, these are not appropriate, these are not good, and so we need to try to get rid of them, whether through medication or therapy or some other means. And absolutely, I would disagree with that kind of dichotomy, because I have a lot of clients who come to me and say like, I just don't want to be anxious anymore. I'm paraphrasing. They don't come out and say it, but that's kind of the baseline of what they are asking for. I don't want to be anxious anymore. And that is just not a helpful way to go about life.
Second, we are told a teacher says, or a child says she might have nervousness about tests. She's taken to a therapist. She's diagnosed with testing anxiety. And what does the school counselor do? They accommodate it. They give her more time on the test. Well, now it's become a problem for life. You just turned, what might have been a short-term problem into a chronic one.
That is a good point. Some of these things can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, there are absolutely responsible ways that a child can end up diagnosed with a certain disorder or a mental health diagnosis. But there are some times too when a teacher raises the possibility of, has your child been tested for ADHD or autism spectrum disorder or oppositional defiant disorder? And that kind of offhand suggestion can make that parent or even the child sometimes reinterpret what those behaviors mean. Suddenly a tantrum might not just be a tantrum, but it might be a larger sign of that something is wrong with their mental state. Or the energy and the hyperactivity that might have been really endearing to the parents before now trigger senses of alarm because they're worried that, oh, is our kid going to be able to function in school if we don't put him on some kind of medication? That kind of stuff does happen a lot, and that's why I do try to caution my parents against trying to define their child and categorizing all of their behaviors under one particular label. People are just too individual for that to be a helpful way of sorting people. I'll also say that she is caricaturing the process a little bit. In theory, even if the teacher has some kind of behavioral concern about a student, they should be having conversations with the parents about it, and then the parents might have the choice to be able to go consult with a mental health professional or a psychologist, something like that. And any diagnosis should be made over a broader period of time, not just in one observation, not just in one environment. By definition, mental health diagnoses need to be more pervasive than just in one particular situation, and across a broader period of time too, so that you don't just capture one really terrible day as an entire diagnosis of major depressive disorder that needs to persist for at least 2 weeks in order to be classified as such. And so that's why I always caution my clients when I first meet them. I tell them I do have to diagnose you because I have to do that in order to be reimbursed by your insurance company. That's a separate issue that we're going to talk about later. But I emphasize to them that this is a provisional diagnosis. I have known you for about 60 minutes at this point. It would be irresponsible for me to just say, you have X. I can say, based on what you're telling me, my mind is going in these couple of directions. Which do you think best explains what's going on for you? And we'll work with that as we uncover more information, as we uncover more patterns of thought and feeling and behavior. And then as we get more information, then we might more definitively say this is what we think is going on. But I don't want to set them in a box right in the first session and have them feel like they have to play up to that part or that role that that diagnosis says and it explains about their behavior.
So let's talk about the therapy that's applied. So there's really two problems. One is the overdiagnosis, then one is the therapy that's applied. So as you say, there's a label that has to be put on everything in order to justify the therapy.
And what he's talking about there, this is the tension that I was trying to talk about. There's some sense in which therapists do have to be very responsible with their diagnosing. There's also a sense in which we're kind of in a catch-22, where ethically, a lot of therapists don't actually agree with diagnosing, especially not diagnosing within the first 60 minutes of meeting somebody for the first time. But the flip side of that is that in order to get reimbursed by insurance, basically how we make our livelihood, we need to have a diagnosis on file for every service, which is the justification for the insurance to pay for this medical service. And so there is this tension between therapists maybe wanting to break out of the mold of diagnosing and be more focused on the individual and the whole person, while insurance needs to be able to put people in different categories so that they can justify the reimbursement and paying the provider. So that doesn't excuse it, but I think it is important for us therapists and other mental health professionals to recognize that dynamic and be able to own that we are inherently in a bit of a conflict of interest when it comes to this diagnosing piece, and to not abuse that and to be very careful about how we use that power, because that's been granted to us through a license, through our education, and through the insurance companies, and can definitely be unhelpful for our clients if we're not using that responsibly and carefully and in dialogue with them.
If a kid is being a brat, yelling at adults or whatever, this now becomes oppositional defiant disorder, for example. What therapy is then applied? Because there are a bunch of different types of therapy, and they're not the same by any stretch of the imagination. When it comes to things like, for example, OCD, there's exposure therapies that are quite effective in terms of getting kids to change their behavior with regard to a thing that's very difficult for them. But then there's therapies like talk therapy that are completely ineffective. Which therapies are good? Which therapies are bad?
Okay, I think we're mixing up some terms here. The talk therapy term seems kind of general, and I don't know if he's referring to kind of like psychodynamic therapy, which is kind of Freudian in its approach and very long-term, very talk and free association based, and will kind of meander in our conversation and your unconscious going to lead us to where we need to be. But categorizing something like that as talk therapy isn't very helpful, because even when you're talking about cognitive behavioral therapy or exposure therapy, those are based in talk as well, unless you want to make a difference between like talk therapies and like somatic therapies that are body based, but you're also talking during that, or like play and art therapy, which are more hands-on and incorporate the child in play and in creative activities. So I think it'd be helpful for him to define his terms a little bit here, because most of what you're going to get from your therapist is some kind of conversation and talk, and just labeling talk therapy as unhelpful across the board doesn't help really differentiate between what you think is helpful and what isn't.
All therapies to be treated the same here.
So, right. So there are two things. So what I'm concerned about is not therapy in response to a problem. When an intervention, if a child has anorexia, if they have severe OCD, if they have a severe phobia, there are really good therapies, like, as you said, exposure therapy, which is cognitive behavioral therapy. And what a therapist will do is they address the problem and they actually measure that the child's getting better.
This is the model that I was trained in, and with my supervision and residency, that was what I was trained to do. Client is coming to me with a problem. We focus on what tools do we need to be able to deal with that problem. When that problem is taken care of, again, like she's talking about, by measuring through instruments or through different inventories, things like that, and observation from parents if that's applicable. Then when that's taken care of, we finish up with therapy, we're done, you move on, and then you come back if there's a different issue. Where I get a disconnect with some of my clients is that some of them want kind of, I don't know if they mean lifelong, but kind of an indefinite therapeutic partnership, where I'm a sounding board for them. They might have a good stretch of time, but they want to hold on to their therapist just in case something goes wrong. And I think that's kind of what she's attacking here, that kind of security blanket mindset where clients want to have a therapist and can't outgrow therapy. But I also do get the realities of that there are a lot of people seeking mental health services right now. There aren't an infinite amount of therapists with an infinite amount of openings. And so it might be very tempting for my clients to want to just hang on and on and on because they knew how hard it was to get an appointment in the first place. And so there are some realities of the mental health care situation that are being ignored in this dialogue that I think contribute to the problem, and I don't know exactly how we fix that. But yes, there's an element of safety and security that leads to that over-reliance on therapy. I would agree with that.
But that's not the majority of what we're talking about. What I'm talking about is so-called preventive mental health care, which we've never been good at. That is treating the well. Treating kids who don't have a significant problem. We're doing this through public schools, through things like social emotional learning. Parents are applying kids with these techniques. They're reading the, best-selling parenting books, all written by therapists, and they're applying with these kids with these constant focus on their emotions. Think about your emotions. And that is leading to more dysregulated kids.
I would agree with that too. This is an example I gave one of my younger clients recently, because a lot of them, like she's talking about, are focused on, am I going to have a good time at this party? Is it going to be enjoyable if I go out with my friends? What about my anxiety that I'm feeling about going out, right? And so sometimes that over-internalization and agonizing about how something's going to turn out can be very unhelpful, because it ends up leading to us usually not enjoying things because we're so in our heads about this. And I think most people can relate to that. And so what I told them was like, hey, if you're in the middle of a really fun sport that you like to play, or a really fun game that you really enjoy, and then you pause and you're like, am I really having fun here? Like, am I having fun? Am I enjoying this? Suddenly you are not having fun anymore. In that moment, you are no longer enjoying it, because you've started turning inward to try to assess what's going on, and you're taking yourself out of the flow and the enjoyment and the companionship and the fun of the game or the activity. And so what I told them is, we would like that guarantee that we're going to enjoy something with no restrictions, no anxiety, no sadness, whatever involved. But most of the time, we only know that we've had a good time after the fact, not before and not during.
But as you said, look, therapies for things like phobias and OCD, they're very good. They might even be essential.
So let's talk for a second about the parents in all of this. So in this equation, we've talked about the kids, we've talked about the therapist, but it is the parent who's supposed to be the guardian of their kids from this sort of stuff. And there does seem to be, if we're going to talk about the narcissism of the modern generation, we may be focusing on the wrong generation. We may be focusing on young people who can't take care of themselves, their kids, but it's their parents who are really the problem. Because it used to be that if your kid failed in a particular way, your first thought was reflexive. What did I do? What could I change about my behavior that would maybe change the behavior of my kid? If a teacher came to you and complained about your kid in class, the move wouldn't be to then respond by either medicalizing the kid or by saying that the teacher did something wrong. It might be to say, okay, what am I doing wrong as a parent that I can change at home to actually drill some sense into my kid? And now it's...
And that is something that I do, is to try to empower parents, that a lot of them do feel very helpless, especially when it comes to the phones and social media and the discipline at school kind of thing. Anytime I have a kid, I'm trying to work with the entire family, especially the parents, because they are the most important key in their child's development. I see their kid maybe an hour every week. They're with their kids so much more and have so much more influence despite what it may feel like. And it's my job to help them realize that and leverage that in the best way to move their child towards independence and wellness. And so I never want to come off to a parent as, oh, you're not parenting well, you shouldn't have this kid, you should just let me parent. That is never what I intend to communicate. I'm always trying to be very careful to emphasize the limits of my authority, and I'll be working with them to try to create the best environment for you at home so that you can thrive, so you can do well. But no, absolutely. One of the most important things I can do as a therapist working with the child is to empower their parents to be able to raise their kids, to feel like they are capable of doing so well.
It seems as though parents are outsourcing the problems to everybody else. If you medicalize a problem, then obviously it's not your fault that the problem is occurring, it's a medical problem. And if that problem can only be solved by a third party, like a therapist, then that prevents you as a parent from having to actually do the hard work necessary in order to curb your child's behavior, which is the most unpleasant part of parenting. I mean, you're a parent, I'm a parent. The worst part of parenting is saying no. Kids, of course, think that the worst part of saying that your parents love saying no to you, they want to say no. Saying no to your kids is like the worst thing in the entire world.
There are some clients I've had where I was one of the first people to say no to them. And that's a terrible place for me to be as a therapist, because it kind of outlines how much work we have to do and how I need to be working with the parents to empower them to be able to say no and to be able to imagine that the consequences and the words that they say have an effect, have an impact, and will stick. But that's also why it's very important for me to have these boundaries Because no, I don't want to be the parent, the de facto parent to a bunch of these kids on my caseload. I don't want to be a parent to any of them. I have kids of my own, that's enough for me. And so no, I'm always about empowering the parent, letting them kind of guide, okay, so I think we're in agreement that this is what the problem is and this is where we like it to go. How do you think we should get there? What can we change within your family and how you parent or what the kid's routine is to be able to get to that point? And I'm not telling them what the solution is. A lot of times I don't even have a solution for them in mind because I'm an outsider to their family. They need to know and be able to figure out what works for them so that when they come up with another problem in the future, they're not having to turn to me or another third party to get the answer. They have the resources within their own family unit to be able to figure out this is what we need to do. And I can just promote the communication, the problem solving to be able to get to that point where the parents know that they can figure it out.
Especially because, I mean, to be frank, kids are really, really stupid when they're little. And so you'll tell them, if you do A, then B will happen. And then they will do A and B will happen. And they'll get very angry at you and upset with you and say, I didn't want B to happen either. That was why I made the threat. That is why I told you about this conditional statement, if A, then B. But parents who are so desperate not to say no to their kids are now outsourcing this problem to the therapy profession.
Right. So I started the book with that hypothesis. I thought it had to do with the way they were being raised. I noticed that parents were very gentle with their kids. They didn't want to say no. They were always asking their kids for input on the job they were doing. This is so-called gentle parenting, or what I call therapeutic parenting, because it's very feelings focused. It's very, abjuring your own authority and focusing on your child's feelings. Okay. But why do I ultimately not think this is because parents were driving it? So what I realized, and I realized this after I did an investigation into the schools, what I realized is that they had all these mental health experts at your kid's school. Very often that's the place where most mental health experts are the most aggressive. The school counselors, the school psychologists, were so undermining parents' confidence in they weren't trusting themselves. And in fact, since I've written the book, I am inundated with letters from parents thanking me that they don't have to feel guilty anymore when they punish a child for bad behavior. See, the therapeutic experts had so convinced them that they would traumatize the kid if they took away their smartphone or engaged in any other discipline, the parents were afraid to do it.
And again, this is where I'll say trends are important. That this is not talking about every school counselor, this is not talking about every school psychologist, but that things generally in the school seem to be moving in this direction. And this is where I've talked about therapy speak being kind of over proliferated, that when you talk about trauma and it's traumatic to have your phone being taken away, I don't know whether it's the kids co-opting that language or the parents getting the wrong signal from the school staff about what trauma actually is. But this is where we use trauma so much that it's kind of lost its clinical significance. It doesn't refer to what it was designed to refer to anymore, and it's just become this catch-all. I'm a bad parent because I'm traumatizing my kids somehow. And again, this is not to bash on school counselors because they have tons of stuff to do. I don't know how any of them have the time to be so overzealous about social emotional learning stuff because they have so many kids that they have to keep an eye on. But apparently that is a concern that Shrier has.
This is one of the problems you've been discussing throughout your career, particularly in your last book and also in this book, this cult of expertise that so many people have given into. And of course, we all use heuristic shortcuts throughout life because we can't all be experts on everything. I mean, if you got a medical problem, of course you're going to go to a doctor. You didn't go to medical school. But when we decide that there is a class of experts, and these experts actually have an ulterior motive in maximizing their own importance, in maximizing the scope of their own jurisdiction, it makes it very difficult for parents to shy away from that. If you get a call from a school therapist saying your kid has oppositional defiant disorder, for example, you don't know what the hell they're talking about. You think that's an actual disorder that is commonly applied and that the therapist has some sort of objective metric that can be used in order to obtain that diagnosis. And only when you dig into things do you realize that, well, maybe the metric that's being used for the diagnosis is inherently vague. Maybe it turns out that there's really no great way to diagnose this problem, and it's just a label being put on a certain set of behaviors that really doesn't apply.
Opinions about oppositional defiant disorder aside, I think Shapiro has a great point in that therapy has proliferated to the point where so many people see therapists and that we're in schools and we are apparently writing bestsellers. I haven't gotten to that point yet, but I think I would love to at some point. That we are a small but highly influential group of people within our culture, and we need to own that as therapists. That I don't remember what the term was, it's like cult of expertise or something like that. But yeah, people do look to us as experts. And while that's not necessarily a bad thing, that means we have to own that we have that mantle, that whether we like it or not, we're in a profession where people look to us as experts on mental health. And so we need to be responsible with that. We need to be careful with that. What kind of advice do we dispense? Is it research-based? Is it evidence-based? Are the suggestions that we're suggesting, are they just based on our personal experiences and feelings? And that's where I always try to be careful. Anytime I give advice or say, hey, maybe we could try this to a client, I make sure that I emphasize where that information is coming from. I might say, hey, some of my past clients have said, or okay, so the research says, and that's where I'm giving them evidence-based information. But it's always important for me to qualify whether I'm giving them, well, research doesn't say much about this, or I'm not up to speed on that. Some of my other clients have said this was helpful for them. Take that with a grain of salt because that is just their experience. Or, hey, I think we should go this route because the evidence says that this is, however percent effective in people, and this is what we should try to work through. If it doesn't work, then we go to things that are less well-researched or less well-established. But we need to own that authority and influence if we're going to be honest about the way that we go about our profession. So with all that being said, I'm going to skip towards the end. We're going to talk a little bit about what she sees as the solutions.
World, you get to be an angsty teenager when you're 34, 35 years old. Like at a certain point, in human history, that was a point where some women were grandmothers. Like I don't even know what we're talking about here, but that is the entire generation we've created, and what that means that there's another generation that simply is not going to exist. I think this does contribute in a sort of backward way to the Tim Carney point, which is that people who are not capable of having kids just will not have kids.
And here's the other thing. Here's the secret in my view, and that is that growing up, taking on responsibilities is actually the solution to a lot of teenage angst. Thinking of others, doing for others, having that outward focus actually makes you feel less angsty about your own situation. And not only are they not being raised to feel ready for that, they don't feel up to it. They are so focused on themselves. And I totally agree with you. Of all the things I worry about the rising generation, I think, and I have kids, I think about my own kids, of all the things that looks hard growing up today, the hardest looks dating.
And so, yeah, she's on a roll. So I wanted to address this. Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the parents that I meet with are very concerned with their kids' readiness for certain things, moving up to the next grade, handling different scheduling things, taking on their own responsibilities, being responsible for their own emotions. And so I've had to encourage many parents over the past couple of months, let their kids own their own emotions. So like a lot of parents are anxious on behalf of their kids. And then when the parents set the tone of that anxiety, then the kids pick up on it and say, oh, this is something I need to watch out for. This is something I need to be anxious about. And for whatever reason, those parents don't trust their own kids to have those emotions and either communicate them or be able to cope with them. And if you have a kid who's had a history of suicide attempts, then absolutely yes, be more on guard. But what I've had to encourage a lot of parents is, hey, let's take a step back. Let's see what your kid can do if we give them the space to be able to explore, to be able to fail a little bit, to be able to get hurt and get back up. And for the most part, in my experience at least, this is anecdotal, but these kids have stepped up when they've been given the space to grow up, to be able to help others, or to be less self-focused, or be able to handle their emotions. They've been able to do that. And my job as a therapist with these families is to empower the parents to feel confident enough to let their kids figure that out.
Because when you have a population so focused on itself and its own feelings, as you said, forming a family with such people looks almost impossible.
Yeah, I think this is also one of the reasons why you see differential rates, as you mentioned, in other countries, of happiness among young people in other countries. The more, as you say, the more responsibility you give to young people, the happier they are, actually. I mean, kids are actually looking for responsibilities. They want to be given, they want to be treated as people who are capable of carrying forward those responsibilities.
I'll also say really quickly that yes, he's absolutely right. A lot of my clients Teenagers, college students are asking me, how do I get more confident? How do I feel more confident around people? I always tell them, you're not gonna like the answer. You practice it, you do it. It doesn't come from changing your mind first and then your actions can follow. You have to do it and build that confidence for yourself, whether it's an ability to accomplish tasks or do difficult things or care about other people. You figure it out, and the confidence comes from knowing that you're capable.
Actually given our kids, in some ways, the worst message, which is follow your dream, no responsibilities. When the reality is what most people are looking for is a place in life. They're looking for a thing to do. They're looking for an actual program that is going to bring them meaning in their lives. And you see that in places around the world where there is a program for bringing meaning in their lives. So I'm going to take the example of Israel again, just because it's the one I'm most familiar with. In Israel, when you're 18 years old, you go and do national service and you go to the army. And that is a radical burden. I mean, you literally stop your life and you go to a place where you might be killed. I mean, right now they're at war. And yet young people in Israel are significantly happier by the numbers than young people in the United States, where they have no such burdens. There's no draft. You're not expected to do anything. The federal government might relieve your student loans. You can go major in something completely useless. But in Israel, you are expected to contribute immediately upon hitting the age of 18. And then when you're done with that, you're expected to get a job, and you're expected to get married, and you're expected to have kids, and you're expected to contribute to the community and to the nation. And we've lost that. That used to be the way it was in the United States also. I mean, if you go back to the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, that was the way that it was. If you were a young person, it's not that you were expected to go to the military because there wasn't a draft until the late 30s, but you were expected to get a job. The understanding was that as you graduated high school, you were either going to college to get better credentialed to get a job, or you were going to go out and start supporting your family and go get a job and move out of the house right now. And you were expected to get married. And as we keep...
But some of the clients that I get most excited about are those ones who were in high school and maybe for some reason college didn't quite work out for them, or they felt kind of aimless and lost after that, and they started working. They started picking up jobs. At first it was slow and difficult because it's hard to get jobs, but they found some jobs, kept working, earned some money for themselves, and eventually just one thing turns into another. They had so much trouble with like community colleges and different universities, but as they worked and found a sense of purpose, not because they explored that in therapy, but because they were establishing it, creating it for themselves through their work, they were able to find greater independence. They were able to find, oh, this is like what I was meant to do. This is what I can do. This is what I'm capable of. I've experienced this with a bunch of clients who have, without all the extra talk and therapy and all of that stuff, they figured things out because they went and did it. I think he's completely on point with that.
Delaying this sort of stuff, it's not that people are getting happy.
Right.
It turns out that we now have, you know, what my friend Jordan Peterson would say is choice paralysis. We're faced with an enormous, you can do anything you want. Well, what if I don't want to do any of those things because I don't know which one of those things to choose?
Right. So what can American parents do? Start with chores. Chores is a great way to give kids independence and a sense that they are contributing to the greater good, which, by the way, is amazing for their mental health. Look, exactly what you said in the book. You know, I compare other cultures who are doing better than American kids. One of them is Israel in terms of things like anxiety and depression. And they're on the same smartphones. But what they are doing, as you said, is they have to grow up. They have to take on responsibility for someone besides themselves. And we have divested American kids of this in two ways. One, we have to give them chores. We don't give them any responsibility. We don't give them any independence. We need to. They have to be sent to the store or to work on a project that will better the family. Okay. So these types of things are really good. But here's the other thing we don't do. In our trauma-obsessed culture, we're afraid to tell them what their grandparents and great-grandparents went through because we're so afraid of traumatizing them. What they need to be told is your grandparents and great-grandparents, they've gotten through really hard things, and you can too.
And so I think while I may not agree with Shapiro and Shrier's politics, she makes a good point about empowering clients to know that, hey, you actually don't need me for the rest of your life. You can figure this out. You have the emotional capacity and the resilience to be able to deal with some of these challenges. And yes, maybe therapy is useful on an interim basis while you figure things out or with a specific challenge. But I want every one of my clients to walk away with the belief instilled that they are capable in themselves of handling their emotional lives. And so I feel a lot of our criticisms of therapy and how it's done today and where the trends are going in our culture. I think those are some legitimate concerns, and the statistics, of course, however you decide to interpret them, do warrant a closer look. Even though so many people are getting therapy, the depression and anxiety rates are still skyrocketing. What do we need to change about that? And your explanation for that may be different, but she's at least taking a look at one particular explanation that you may or may not agree with that is actionable for parents, for therapists, and for clients themselves. And so because I take this profession seriously, and I know at the end of the day, my purpose is to be helpful for my clients, not helpful for myself, not make a ton of money, which it doesn't anyway. That's why I'm willing to take kind of these closer looks at books that are about criticizing and critiquing my field of interest and my field of work, because it'll help me to be better, and at least to have some of these considerations for my influence. Am I supplanting parents? Am I disempowering parents and clients in favor of my own paycheck or my own influence? And make sure that I'm actually working towards promoting the good of my clients and society in general. So everyone, thank you so much for watching this video. Turns out I had a lot more to say about that than I thought I did. I thought this would be a shorter video, but I hope that engaging with these ideas is helpful as you think about your own mental health journey and your relationship with your therapist, if you have one, or if you're a practitioner yourself. Even, again, if you disagree with her explanations of things and her and Shapiro's politics, great, fine. We can have discussions about that too. But I think we need to be able to address some of these concerns that she brings up as a journalist about some of the worrying trends and comparisons to other cultures that she sees and in their outcomes for children's mental health. So everyone, thank you so much for watching this video. Again, please do like and subscribe. It helps the channel to grow and create more content like this where we're engaging with ideas. I really look forward to the discussion in the comments with this video in particular. So thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you all next time.